You are listening to A Light to the Nations. This podcast is a production of the Ephesus School Network.
Hello, and welcome to episode 83 of A Light to the Nations. I'm your host, Father Fred Shaheen. In Scripture, God's mercy is expressed through his extending life to the next generation. We hear this demonstrated in two parallel stories in the Gospel of Mark. The first in the raising of Jairus' daughter in chapter 5, and the other one in the healing of the man's son who had a mute spirit in chapter 9. In both of these, terminology found later in the Bible when St. Paul speaks of Jesus being raised from the dead and then standing in that raised position appear in the same sequence that we find them in the stories from Mark chapter 5 and chapter 9. Let's hear the text from Mark chapter 5 about Jairus' daughter. While he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. When he came in, he said to them, "Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. But when he had put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kumi," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat. That's Mark chapter 5, verses 35 through 43. In verse 41, the phrase that is rendered in both Aramaic and Greek, ἐγείρω, uses the verb ἐγείρω in the imperative, arise. In the verse that follows, we hear that immediately she arose and walked. That second verb is ἀνίστημι, from ἀνίστημι, which means to be standing upright. There are two things to note here. First, the use of both Aramaic and Greek in this passage functions to address the hearers of the gospel and Jesus' three disciples, Peter, James, and John, who are associated with the leadership in Jerusalem, along with the parents of the girl. This underscores that the gospel message applies to both Jews and Greeks alike. Second, the text tells us that the girl immediately arose and walked. In the Bible, the verb to walk, peripateo, is technical terminology. It refers to following a certain path, which is the way of the gospel. Moreover, although the two verbs in verses 41 and 42 sound similar in English, they function differently in the original Greek. The first one is ἐγείρω, often a transitive verb, meaning it takes a direct object, and its meaning is to lift or raise up something. The second verb, ἀνίστημι, means to be in the standing position. It is what results from the action of the first verb. Jesus commands her to be lifted up, ἐγείρω, and consequently she is said to be in the standing position, ἀνέστη. These same two verbs are used in the same sequence in another passage from Mark chapter 9. About the man with the boy with a mute spirit who brought the boy to Jesus' disciples. Let's hear verses 25 through 27. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter no more. Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him. And he became as one dead, so that many said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. Like the daughter of Jairus, the boy here appears to be dead. And that is emphasized by the repetition in verse 26 that many said he is dead. This parallels the repetition we hear in chapter 5, first in the announcement made to Jairus that he shouldn't trouble the teacher any longer because his daughter is dead, and then in the refuting of that claim by Jesus, who says that she is only sleeping. In this passage, in verse 27, we hear that Jesus took the boy by the hand and lifted him up, ἐγείρω, and he arose, ἀνίστημι. Notice how, in both of these stories, we have a person who was thought to be dead and who is then raised up, ἐγείρω, and finally in the standing position that is ἀνίστημι. These are the same two terms that are used in the letters of St. Paul to speak of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. In chapter 1 of Galatians, we hear, Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. ἐγείραντος, from ἐγείρω. And in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, we hear in verse 14, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. Here it is the verb ἀνέστη. The first verb is an action by God, who raises up Jesus. Notice that grammatically this is a transitive verb in which God is the agent and Jesus is the direct object, the one being raised. The second verb, ἀνίστημι, refers to being or standing upright. It can be transitive or intransitive. In these instances, it describes the outcome of someone or something having been raised up. Mark's use of these two verbs is intelligent. He is introducing already in chapter 5 the word that will be used by Jesus in the three predictions of his passion, in chapters 8, 9, and 10, and in chapter 16 by the young man who announces that Jesus is not in the tomb, but is risen. And he employs the terminology of Paul, who teaches that it was God who raised Jesus from the dead. As a result of that action, Jesus is in the standing position. He is ἀνέστη. In the two passages from chapter 5 and chapter 9, however, it is Jesus who raises someone, lifts them up, ἐγείρω, and as a result of that action, both of them are said to be standing, ἀνέστη. Mark's use of the two verbs in that specific sequence reflects the teaching that just as God raises Jesus from the dead, he gives Jesus the power to raise the dead for judgment. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 5, we hear, for as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice and come forth, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. That's verses 26 through 29. In English translations of the Nicene Creed in the Antiochian Orthodox tradition, it is said that Christ rose again on the third day, and this sometimes raises the question, why do we say again? He didn't rise more than once, did he? But this only poses a problem in the English, where we don't distinguish between those two Greek verbs, the one which means to raise something up, and the second one which means to be standing as a result of being raised up. So to say that Christ rose again is really to say that he was once again in the standing position, and our Paschal proclamation, Christos Anέστη, which is translated Christ is risen, is more properly Christ is again standing upright as a direct result of the action by God of raising him up. The most impressive aspect of the two passages from the Gospel of Mark is that they depict the healing of children. In chapter 5, it is not Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, with the need, but rather his 12-year-old daughter. In chapter 9, it is not the man from the crowd with a mute spirit, but rather his son, who is said to have been afflicted from childhood. We also find this in Mark chapter 7, where we hear about a Syrophoenician woman pleading on behalf of her daughter. That's verses 24 through 30. The emphasis on progeny demonstrates how Scripture is offering another chance and is thus an expression of God's mercy. That second chance provides life not only to the hearers, but to the following generations as well, through its words of instruction. This is at its clearest in the story of the children of Israel entering Canaan. Although the Lord had brought them out of Egypt and instructed them on Mount Sinai, none of the ones who left Egypt entered Canaan. That is why Joshua circumcises them upon entering the land and repeats the words of the law to them. The law, which had been intended to give life, did not do that because of the stubbornness and rebellion on the part of the people. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul recounts for the Corinthians how their fathers crossed the Red Sea and were led in the wilderness and were even fed by God, yet they were struck down by him. And he concludes that, although these things happened to their fathers, they were written down as a warning to them, the addressees of his letter, whom he positions at the end of the ages. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 11. And this is precisely God's touch of grace, providing, in the telling and retelling of the biblical story, instruction for his children, to the hearers of that story in every generation. And this brings us to the conclusion of episode 83 of A Light to the Nations. I thank you for listening today, and I look forward to meeting you again next time.